I'm here in the Sunshine State to tell the story of the Barber-Mizell feud, and unlike the Hatfields and McCoys, this feud was fought in creek beds and swamps around Orlando, Florida, and it claimed 41 lives from 1870 to 1871, making it one of the most violent non-military frontier conflicts in American history. And I'm going to do my best to tell it from the perspective of both the Barber family clan and the Mizell clan. Now, to begin with, the Barbers settled here around the 1830s, and if you know anything about Florida history, you know this is a very dangerous idea because of the ongoing Seminole Wars. In fact, the Barber clan lost quite a few members during the Indian raids, and by the time of the Civil War, they had established themselves as one of the largest cattle operators in the state. Unlike the Wild West, where cattlemen were viewed with an air of suspicion and jealousy and anger because they had exploitative practices, in Florida during Reconstruction, the Barber family clan, which was led, of course, by Mose Barber, buried here behind me, was viewed very favorably. Now, the reasons for this are complex, but not too difficult to understand. During that war between the states, the Union Army had blockaded all of Florida, making shipment to the Caribbean impossible. And after the Civil War, there was Reconstruction, which businesses floundered in. However, now the blockade had been lifted, men like Mose Barber, who had 20,000 head of cattle, could easily ship them over to Cuba, which found it very difficult to grow milking cows and make an unimaginable amount of wealth, which funneled directly back into the fledgling Orlando. Well, of course, the Union Army viewed him with an air of suspicion because, as it's marked on his tombstone, he was a Confederate veteran. Now, he had some skeletons in his closet, which I'll bring up later, but they viewed him very suspiciously. And so they went to the Mizell family, which had an ongoing feud with the Barbers, who had also been established here for a good deal of time. And to the Mizells, they bestowed positions of authority. To David Mizell, they bestowed the position of sheriff. To his brother, they gave a large farm that was located right next to the Barber family. And to his other brother, they made him a judge. And of course, there was that interrelated judge-sheriff relationship that they brought down on any of their enemies like an iron fist. And of course, the nearest man to them was Mose Barber, a man whom they didn't like. So they kept dragging his sons and his brothers into court, and of course, the local population just kept acquitting them. So eventually, the judge decided to charge Mose Barber $500 to pay off the court for their time spent in the courtroom. Of course, Mose Barber, by now painting himself as an unreconstructed Confederate and painting the Mizells as Union collaborators, refused to pay that. And then now you've got the sheriff David coming at him saying, well, you're not paying the high taxes on large cattle herds, so I'm going to come and seize a couple of your cows. He goes to his brother, the judge, and gets a warrant issued, takes his other brother, the landowner, and rides along with his young son over to the Barber family farm. And this was just disregarding a warning that came earlier from Mose, which said, if you come onto my farm uninvited, you're going to leave in a pine wood box. And that's just what happened. They were ambushed on the road leading up to the Barber farm. And as David Mizell, the sheriff, is bleeding out, his brother, the landowner, rides back to Orlando on a horse while his young son holds on to him. And David Mizell says, please, for the love of God, there's too much tension between these two families. My last dying wish is that you don't seek retribution. And that was a very short-lived wish. Nobody heeded it, and the resulting feud would kill 41 people. Now, immediately the judge issued a posse status, and they went out with 20 people who had sided with the Mizells, and they executed Mose Barber's son, and then they found Mose Barber and drowned him in the lake. And that's what everyone thought, because after the Barber family had been killed, the war waged on for a couple months before they usually left the area. Them and their supporters and outsiders who were picking sides were forced out of town, and then the courthouse burned along with all the records, and things simmered down. Now, everybody thought that Mose Barber died in 1870, but here it is in the mid-1890s, and elderly Mose Barber comes shambling back to his old plantation looking for poor man status. This is somebody who used to be one of the largest cattle barons in the state, now asking to live on the dole. And the story was so complex that people basically forgot. And the basic idea is this feud, most people think that Mose Barber died, so that's the story most people know. But in reality, he lived to 1898. And this is just left out of most of the story. So I'm going to do my best to give you an objective beginning to end. Immediately after the slaying of the Sheriff of Orlando, David Mizell, the entire clan got together and met in the law offices of the judge, who just so happened to be the brother of the assassinated sheriff. And there they were given orders to take no prisoners and given official posse comitatus status. They marched down to the Barber farm, and there they encountered Isaac Barber, the son of Mose Barber, whom they believed was responsible for the death of their relative. There, they tied him to a tree, and 20 men lined up and all pulled their triggers at the exact same time. And then they went to the farm and took Mose Barber, where supposedly they chained him up and threw him in the lake. However, even though newspapers said that Mose was found, he turned up in the 1890s, dying in 1898, so he actually escaped. But whenever anybody would mention anything favorable about the Mizell clan, the widowed, soon-to-be wife of Isaac Barber would pull out his bloody shirt until her dying days and show the brutality of that clan. Now, what's so interesting about this, and I don't want to victim blame in this at all, is that the level of brutality suggests something deeper, something simmering between the Barbers and the Mizells. This was such a brutal killing of an innocent kid, really. And when you look into it, what you find is that this image of a unreconstructed Confederate that Mose Barber was trying to construct for himself was actually something of a facade. Yes, he did serve in the Confederacy, he served in the Ambulance Corps, but in the last months of the Civil War in 1865, he went over to Union lines and informed on where the Confederate positions were. So of course, Mizell, who was also a Confederate veteran, saw this as a betrayal. In fact, all 4 of his sons had served in the war, and 2 of them had actually died. So he saw through Mose Barber's facade and viewed his family as nothing but profiteers and traitors to a Southern cause. And when the entire town gathered around him and said he's a good Confederate, of course, Mizell gritted his teeth and continued poking and prodding the Barber family until this violence finally exploded. And I think that kind of accounts for why he, in his dying breaths, begged for peace, a peace which was never delivered. And you can see here someone has actually left a shotgun shell at the grave of Isaac Barber. And as you can see from the tombstones, much like the Hatfields and McCoys, the Barber family never left this part of Florida. And the slain son of Mose Barber, Isaac, is buried right over there. And you can see here it's almost like a military cemetery, divided along the lines of sides, because in the back of the cemetery you have Isaac Barber, and you have the grave of his son right there, and you also have the Yates clan buried here. Of course, these folks weren't alive during the time of the feud, but you can see that tensions were simmering, and the families were very, very closely tied. And from the feud's outset, the patriarchs of both clans had been killed. Mose Barber had shot the sheriff, David Mizell, and the Mizell family sent a posse to go and kill Mose Barber. And they could have buried the hatchet there if it weren't for the fact that this posse also found Mose Barber's son, tied him to a tree, and had 20 people line up and all shoot at the same time so that not one of them could be convicted for the murder. Well, this turned a family feud into a war. And this could actually be considered an extension of the Civil War because of a man who may likely be buried somewhere behind me if the story of his ambushing is true. Now understand that in the time leading up to the feud, as I mentioned earlier, Mose Barber had cultivated this image of himself as an unreconstructed Confederate and had painted the Mizell family as Union collaborators. And so when they shot him and his son, a lot of local people naturally sided with them. And one of these was the Yates family, led by Needham Yates. And Needham was also a local politician. He had come here just before the Civil War from his farm in Georgia and had taken up a position in the Florida House of Representatives in 1860, and he didn't leave at the outset of the Civil War, so the Mizell family viewed him as a natural ally of the Barber family. And he was moving along with his son, another Needham, Needham Jr., and with William Yates along the road, and they had accused him of shooting the sheriff after they had already killed Mose Barber. So they've kind of shifted the goalpost, and they've now blamed this Florida representative. And so they come down and they shoot him. But the newspapers are a little vague because it says that Needham, along with his son, Needham Jr. and William, were shot, And then it says later that John Mose Barber Jr. was likewise shot and killed. Now, this would lead you to suspect that the other 3 folks were shot and killed. In fact, there's no other records of them really existing, and you can find graves that seem to be of them, but there's no real record of a Florida politician being shot and buried here. And much like Mose Barber, I seem to think that they could have changed their names and come back years later after the feud settled down, because naturally, as things really heated up, a lot of people were put in the county courthouse, and there was a fire which destroyed all the records after everybody was acquitted. So people scattered. And then years later, they came back. And if you look around the cemetery today, you will see dozens of the Overstreet and the Yates clan. And what makes me think, one last note about the Yateses, that they were truly on the side of the Barber family, is how pro-Confederate they were. Again, the Barbers had this image of truly unreconstructed Confederate tax protesters. And when the grandson of Needham Yates was born, they named him Jesse James Yates. And of course, Jesse James continued his own personal war for years after the Civil War had already ended. The Yates ambush remains one of the most mysterious parts of the whole feud. Even in the best narratives, it's mostly a footnote, and it happened not far away from where one of the victims is buried, on Boggy Creek Road, right outside these cemetery walls. Needham Yates Sr. was actually arrested alongside his brother John, which some papers reported wrongly as his son. Later folklore embellished the mistake, claiming that he was ambushed with his 2 sons. However, later reports listed the sons as William Yates, who's buried in front of me, and Needham Jr., because at least one paper implied that all 3 were killed, applying to a Barber relative that sneaky phrase, likewise shot and killed. I should point out that William Yates is buried right here. In fact, William is one of the few direct ties to Needham Sr. that can be found in all of Florida, buried in this plot in the Rose Hill Cemetery outside of Kissimmee, and his father is listed in his death certificate. So we know it's him, and we know that he survived to be nearly 100 years old, dying in 1925. His son, Jesse James Yates, is buried right next to him, also unmarked. And we're turning right now onto Old Boggy Creek Road, which is where the Yates ambush actually took place. The road took its name from the creek. And of course, the creek was named because the ambush resulted in the Mizell clan getting bogged down inside of the creek bed. I really wish the Barber-Mizell feud had as clear-cut an ending as the French Eversole War, that they would have buried the hatchet, but it seems like most of them scattered to the winds, and over time some of the Barbers returned. In fact, nearly 30 years later, Mose, whom everybody thought died on the first day of the feud, returned to the north of Orlando. And the Mizells mostly scattered and never really returned to the Orlando area, but here you have the grave of Captain John R. Mizell. He's the judge and the brother of the sheriff who issued the warrant to go and seize the cattle that caused the initial confrontation, and he officiated the status of the 20 men who went back to take no prisoners. And much like Mose Barber, he never really returned to his hometown. He died here in 1908.